Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosen Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. Brunello, you made a trip to the United States last week to attend the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, this is a annual affair. I think you sort of visit these meetings, more than once a year. But I can imagine that the mood at these meetings be sort of remarkably different this time than usual. Tell me a bit more about that and what was sort of top of the agenda this time around.
I went to the spring meetings. They occur once a year, and overall, the IMF meets twice a year. The annual meetings are in October. So every 6 months, people from around the world go to DC to get a sense of what's going on. And typically, every time we go there, some form of crisis, whether it's incoming crisis, existing crisis, or just resolved crisis. So it's always pre, post, or during crisis periods. And then you have the country everybody talks about. I remember they used where Greece was the key one, or Italy and the pigs. The UK was at the center of attention in 2022 at the time of the Liz Truss government and the mini budget crisis. So, that was the typical way things went. And people go there just to get a sense of what the boss say, if we may use this expression, right? They are held in DC for a reason. There are huge historical motivations why the IMF and World Bank are located in Washington, DC. We have discussed this in the past. Um, and you go there because you think that the Americans generally find a way of solving crises. They are so big, they have so many resources that can effectively suggest a way out of the crisis and potentially put some money on the table if it's needed. They just extended during those meetings, for example, another 20 billion loan to Argentina, as we know. So, they are, and the majority shareholder of the IMF, of course, is the US, which means that they can effectively decide. So it was with some sense of bewilderment, if we can use this word, that we came there to discuss about the crisis country du jour, which in this case was the US itself. Because as we know, in the previous weeks, the US administration has announced all sorts of um, uh, uh, policies that clearly were not liked by the market. The market sold off massively until there was a sort of um, uh, backpedaling by the US administration, especially on tariffs, which meant effectively the market could enjoy a bit of a reprieve. The other thing that we discussed last week was, of course, firing Jay Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, that in the eyes of this administration is not doing enough to support the bond and equity market. Also, on that front, luckily, last week, during the MF meetings, Trump struck a slightly more conciliatory tone and didn't pursue with this intention. Actually, say, I have no intention of firing Powell. So, it was a bit of a backpedaling on all the major issues, all the major problems that allowed a bit of a reprieve during the week. There was no sense of crisis and urgency that we had the week before. The mood was still of somehow surprises of being there with a totally different agenda from previous meetings.
Yeah. And one of the things you talk about in your newsletter is at the center of this crisis, the idea that this administration is pursuing a number of goals, which often seem to be, entirely contradictory to one another. You simply can't have all of these coming true in the same agenda. Could you talk to me a bit more about that idea?
Yeah, because that's at the center of the crisis, right? Every government can make mistakes and correct them. Every moment a government can face crisis and come out of them. But the problem of this administration is that they have a completely inconsistent set of policies that don't um, make almost impossible to achieve. So just some examples are you cannot possibly have the strongest economy in the world with the lowest level of unemployment while having at the same time the lowest level of policy and market interest rates. It doesn't make sense. The two things don't go hand in hand. You cannot have high tariffs and low inflation. You cannot have mass deportations and full employment. You cannot try to prop up the dollar as the world reserve currency while at the same time encouraging the weakening of the dollar
Hmm.
and the strengthening of other currencies versus the dollars. Uh, or introduce other instruments such as stable coins pegged to the dollar that could be a substitute for the dollar itself as a reserve currency, uh, while at the same time maintaining this idea that the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. I mean, you cannot possibly want all these things at the same time and not having a market reaction to this announcement that effectively makes it explicit. These are inconsistent goals. So once you announce something, you have a market reaction of some sort. When you announce the opposite, you have a market reaction on the other way around. And you might always have a negative input on the bond market, on the dollar, on the equity markets. And in the crisis peak a couple of weeks ago, all asset classes sold off because it was kind of an EM style crisis where you completely lose confidence in the country. So there was a sell-off in equities, bonds, currency, and credit, I mean, all at the same time.
Yeah. Um, you also point out the idea that before these meetings happened, on a lot of these sort of more controversial ideas, Trump had made a bit of a U-turn on his sort of his flagship proposals. What were some of those U-turns? Do you see that as part of a broader shift of the administration, or is it only a sort of short-term reprieve?
So the problem is that um, the administration is pursuing, this was just the economic reality we spoke about. If you expand further, there's the attack on the rule of law with the continuous attacks to the judges. One of them was arrested during the IMF meetings in the courthouse, among other things, because he was opposing some of the policies on immigration. The attack on law firms that in a common law system such as the US contribute to create jurisprudence and therefore law itself. And how can you possibly want companies to come and invest in the US? That's the entire goal of tariffs, encouraging repatriation of production, hence investment in the US versus investment abroad, right? While you don't guarantee the rule of law, which is the number one reason why a country is chosen, the UK such as the US, right? So these are fundamental shifts in the US position. This is not a short-term policy proposal that will come and go. And if you have such fundamental shift, then um, this is not going to change overnight. So yes, Scott Bessent made a good job did a good job during the IMF meetings in convincing all delegations that everything can be fixed, and then is there's strategic uncertainty. That's the way you call it. You escalate to de-escalate. That kind of rhetoric. But once you have such fundamental shift in the position of the country, you understand this is something that will come over and over and over again. And Trump is definitely not a person that gives up easily, as we saw in the fact that he decided to run again 3 times in a row. So, and potentially might want to run also in 2028. So this is not a guy that just because he had a pushback from a judge or a legislature or something will give up his ambitions. So the way I conclude my column was, enjoy the reprieve while it lasts, because, you know, there would be more attempts to push these legislations or regulations or new set of norms further, and the market will react to that.
I mean, it seems like, especially to go back to what you mentioned before, sort of through every sign, it looks a lot more like an emerging markets crisis than, an average American recession where one or two economic indicators are off and they're safe havens. This is more about a, much more fundamental level of loss of trust in the sort of political institutions that underpin the American economy. And that's something that, will be a lot more sustainable than sort of short-term movements in the stock market. So as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Very much. Until next time.